With the 2025 federal election fast approaching, Canada's political landscape is undergoing significant shifts. Key battlegrounds are emerging, margins are tightening, and the fight for control is more intense than ever. From conservative strongholds in the prairies to close contests in Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada, every vote will play a crucial role in deciding the country's future. In Nunavut, the NDP is currently leading with 47%, but with a large margin of error of plus 15%. Their actual support could range from as low as 32% to as high as 62%. This means while they are favored, there is still significant uncertainty. The Liberals are polling at 27% with a plus 13% margin, suggesting their real support could be anywhere between 14% and 40%. That leaves room for either a competitive showing or a more distant third-place finish, depending on how undecided voters break. The Conservatives, at 22%, have a plus 12% margin of error, meaning their actual support could be as low as 10% or climb up to 34%, potentially making them more competitive than they initially appear. Meanwhile, the Greens are at 3% with a plus 5% margin, meaning their support could fluctuate between 0% and 8%, keeping them as a minor factor in the race. With such high uncertainty in all parties' numbers, the race in Nunavut remains fluid and could shift depending on voter turnout and late campaign momentum. In the Northwest Territories, the race is a true toss-up between the Liberals, NDP, and Conservatives, with all three parties within striking distance of each other. The Liberals hold a narrow lead at 35%, but with a plus 11% margin of error, their actual support could range anywhere from 24% to 46%. This means they could be firmly ahead or in a dead heat with their rivals. The NDP is close behind at 31%, also with a plus 11% margin, meaning their real support could be as low as 20% or as high as 42%. While they are currently in second place, this range suggests they could still be competitive for the top spot. The Conservatives are polling at 28% with a plus 10% margin of error, putting their actual support between 18% and 38%. This keeps them within reach of both the Liberals and NDP, making this one of the most unpredictable contests in the country. Meanwhile, the Greens sit at 6% with a plus 6% margin, meaning their support could be anywhere from 0% to 12%. While they are not in contention, they could still influence the race by drawing votes from the other parties. With all three major parties overlapping in possible support levels, this remains a highly competitive and uncertain district where even small shifts in voter preferences could determine the final outcome. In Yukon, the Conservatives have a slight edge at 35%, but with a plus 10% margin of error, their actual support could range anywhere from 25% to 45%. While they are currently leading, this margin leaves room for a competitive race. The Liberals are polling at 29% with a plus 9% margin, meaning their real support could be between 20% and 38%. This keeps them well within striking distance of the Conservatives and capable of making gains. The NDP follows closely at 28%, also with a plus 9% margin, putting their actual range between 19% and 37%. With such close proximity to the Liberals, the NDP remains a strong contender in this race. Meanwhile, the Greens are at 6%, with a plus 5% margin of error, meaning their support could range from 1% to 11%. While not a major factor, they could still influence the race by pulling votes from the other parties. With all three major parties overlapping in potential support, Yukon remains a battleground despite a slight conservative lean. A small shift in voter sentiment could change the outcome. In British Columbia's 43 districts, the Conservatives hold a strong lead with 47%, though their plus 6% margin of error means their actual support could range from 41% to 53%. While they remain the dominant party in the province, this range leaves some room for shifts in the race. The NDP sits in second place at 23% with a plus 5% margin, meaning their real support could be anywhere between 18% and 28%. This suggests they are well behind the Conservatives but could still be competitive in certain districts. The Liberals are close behind at 22%, also with a plus 5% margin, putting their actual support between 17% and 27%. This keeps them in contention for second place and shows a slight upward trend in their numbers. Meanwhile, the Greens are at 6%, with a plus 3% margin, meaning their support could be between 3% and 9%. While they are not a major factor in the overall race, they could play a key role in close ridings by drawing votes from other parties. With the Conservatives holding a clear advantage, but the NDP and Liberals fighting for second place, the race in British Columbia will depend on local battles and shifting voter dynamics. In Alberta's 37 districts, the Conservatives maintain a commanding lead with 62%, and with a plus 6% margin of error, their actual support could range from 56% to 68%. This solidifies their dominance in the province, with no serious threat to their position. The NDP is in a distant second at 17%, with a plus 4% margin, meaning their real support could be between 13% and 21%. While they remain the main opposition, they are far behind the Conservatives. The Liberals are polling at 14%, also with a plus 4% margin, placing their actual support between 10% and 18%. While they show a slight upward trend, they remain a minor player in the province. With the Conservatives firmly in control, Alberta continues to be one of the strongest Conservative strongholds in the country, leaving the competition to fight over second place. In the Prairie's 28 districts, the Conservatives remain in a strong position with 53%, though with a plus 6% margin of error, their actual support could range from 47% to 59%. While still dominant, this marks a slight downward trend, indicating some movement in voter preferences. The NDP sits at 20% with a plus 5% margin, meaning their real support could be anywhere between 15% and 25%. While they hold second place, they have also seen a decline in support. The Liberals are close behind at 18% with a plus 4% margin, putting their range between 14% and 22%. This upward trend suggests they are making slight gains, though they remain in third place. Despite some shifts, the Conservatives maintain a clear lead in the region, while the NDP and Liberals continue to battle for second place. In Ontario's 122 districts, the Conservatives lead with 44%, but with a plus 6% margin of error, their actual support could range from 38% to 50%. While they remain ahead, this margin leaves room for movement, making the province a key battleground. The Liberals are polling at 32%, also with a plus 6% margin, meaning their real support could be between 26% and 38%. They are showing an upward trend, keeping them within striking distance of the Conservatives in some ridings. The NDP sits at 17% with a plus 4% margin, placing their actual support between 13% and 21%. This marks a decline, suggesting they may struggle to hold on to certain seats. Meanwhile, the Greens are at 4% with a plus 3% margin, meaning their support could range from 1% to 7%, while the PPC sits at 3%, also with a plus 3% margin, keeping them at the margins of the race. With the Conservatives leading but the Liberals still competitive, Ontario remains a decisive battleground that could shape the overall election outcome. In Quebec's 78 districts, the Bloc Québécois is currently leading with 33%, though with a plus or 5% margin of error. Their actual support could range from 28% to 38%. While they hold the top spot, their lead has slightly decreased, showing room for changes in voter sentiment. The Conservatives are at 25% with a plus 5% margin, meaning their support could range from 20% to 30%. Their numbers are on the rise, signaling potential gains, especially in certain ridings. The Liberals also sit at 25% with a plus 4% margin, putting their actual support between 21% and 29%. While their numbers remain steady, they continue to be in a tight race with the Conservatives for second place. The NDP is polling at 11% with a plus 3% margin, meaning their support could range from 8% to 14%. While they lag behind, they still hold a notable presence in some ridings. The Greens are at 3% with a plus 2% margin, putting their range between 1% and 5%, keeping them as a minor factor in the race. With the Bloc Québécois still in the lead, Quebec's electoral dynamics remain competitive, with the Conservatives and Liberals closely contesting for second place in this province. In Atlantic Canada's 32 districts, the Conservatives are leading with 43%, but with a plus 6% margin of error. Their actual support could range from 37% to 49%. While they remain in the lead, their support has slightly decreased, indicating some potential shifts in voter sentiment. The Liberals are close behind at 34% with a plus 6% margin, meaning their real support could range from 28% to 40%. This marks an upward trend for the Liberals, allowing them to close the gap with the Conservatives. The NDP sits at 15% with a plus 4% margin, putting their support between 11% and 19%. While they are in third place, they have seen a slight decline in support. The Greens are at 4% with a plus 3% margin, meaning their support could range from 1% to 7% with minimal impact on the overall race. While the Conservatives still hold a strong position, the Liberals are gaining ground, making Atlantic Canada a competitive region to watch as the election progresses. Can the Conservatives maintain their lead? Or will the Liberals rally enough support to challenge them? Will the Bloc continue to dominate Quebec, and can the NDP secure the breakthroughs they need? With so much at stake, this election is still wide open. Stay tuned for more updates, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the latest political analysis.